go. All right, so this is an introduction to painting a study of an animal in black and white. And we're going to start by looking at what we need to have handy. You should have a couple of brushes, a larger and smaller one, and a palette knife. You should have a place for mixing your paints. We're using a piece of cardboard. You will need black and white paint and one hue. And I think I wanted to mix up something that was kind of a blue-green, so I have blue and green there. To store your paints, you want to have damp paper towel on top, so you can see I have this paper towel that it's kind of wet, and I'm keeping that over the paints to keep them from drying out. So there are my paints. You also need some water, something to wipe extra paint on. You can use paper towel. I'm using a newspaper spread for that. And this is how we're going to start. You should also have a photograph of an animal that's printed in black and white, really close by. Painting surface. So we're using canvas that's been primed. This should be taped down to a board. All right, so before we start, I'd like you to build a tinted ground for your painting. And what this does is it gives a base for your color, for your painting, so you don't just have the white bottom layer showing through. You have some color underneath it. So to do this, I'm going to mix it on my palette using my palette knife. So I've decided I want to do kind of a blue-green. Notice I'm not putting very much on there, just a little bit. So I've scooped it out with my knife. I can wipe that on the newspaper, and you can see it cleans it up really easily. So I'm not contaminating my colors by dipping it in multiple containers. And I think I want to desaturate it. Now, what would be a color I could use to desaturate greens and blues? Any ideas? What could I use? Possibly a red, and I don't have any in my palette, but I happen to have a black, so I'm just going to, just because I'm being lazy, I'm going to use black to desaturate it. But you could also use a red, would work really well for a blue-green. Okay, so I'm going to mix up my blue-green and then add a teeny bit of the black to it, just so it's a little desaturated. Okay, maybe a bit much. All right, next up, I'm going to take my large brush, and for this bottom layer, just this tinting that we're doing, this should be mostly water. You should be able to see the canvas right through it. So to start, I'm going to actually dip my brush in water, and I'm bringing some water down onto my palette. Then I'm just going to grab the tiniest bit of that paint that I mixed up. And you can see that this is really light and watery and washy. That's about what I want to go for this bottom layer. You don't want it to be really thick paint. This is just to tint the surface. So you should be adding quite a bit of water to it. I'm just dipping my brush, grabbing some paint, and then going on like that. Grabbing a bit more as I go. Also, you don't want it to be too dark, so if it starts going too dark, grab just more water and push it around so that it's not a really dark surface. You want to be able to see some color in there, not really black. All right. So once you have the tinted ground done, and I'm just kind of pushing it, I've got a few little bits of the canvas that are still white, so I'm just pushing that in there. Now, the reason for this is because you may have areas of gray or black in your picture, and you don't want to have little white spots showing through from the canvas. So if we get those all covered up with this kind of watery color, then instead we have color showing through the painting instead of little white spots. So it makes it easier to paint our top layers. Okay, so the second thing we're going to do is we're going to sketch. And I'm going to encourage you to practice sketching with paint and a brush. Now you can always sketch with a pencil, but the nice thing about sketching with a brush is it has kind of a natural painterly look to it. Another reason is you can see it, because if you have a fairly dark tinted ground and you're painting over pencil lines, they could disappear. Now, because we're doing a small painting, we can actually do direct measuring. So for example, if I wanted to sketch this puppy's head, this is my dog, he's a little bit bigger now, I can measure it. So I could take my brush and I can actually put the tip of the brush at the top of the head and then with my finger mark under his nose, and that would tell me about how big I want to go with it on the painting. Now this is a small painting, so I might not get all of the dog on here, and that's okay. It's better to kind of come in close and just have part of your picture in there than to try and get all of it in there. Okay, so how are we going to sketch? Again, we don't want to use thick globs of paint. Like I don't want to use that right there. That's too thick and globby, and what will happen is it will leave ridges in the painting. I want these bottom layers to be thin and watery. So I am going to use some of the black paint. I think I could probably use up some of that blue and green that I have going. I'm just going to add a bit more black to it. But I want to water it down, so I'm going to take the black, and I'm actually dipping my brush in some water, pulling it out, so that I have kind of a thin, watery paint. And if you look at it close, you can see it's not really sticking out on the brush. I just have the brush. Alright, so I think what I'm going to do is to just start with the puppy's head. And I'm just making a mark where I think the top of the head should be. Then what I'm going to do is to measure the head with my brush. And that tells me that the bottom of the head should be right there. So I can just kind of lightly sketch in the shape of the head. And we don't want to do a lot of detail at this point. You can always go in and put detail in later. You just want to kind of get the outline going. Next up, I'm going to measure from the nose to the bottom of the body. So from there to there. And it looks like it's about that long. So I'm going to put the bottom of the body right here. So just doing that direct measuring can kind of help you get the proportions right, so you don't have to worry about that too much, especially if you haven't taken a drawing class and you're not really sure how to approach this. The other thing I can do is I can capture angles. So if I line up the edge of my picture with my painting, I can then line up my brush with the angle of something like the angle of the leg, and then bring it over here and just visualize it and then quickly paint it in. So I'm kind of capturing what that angle is and from where. I think I have that one a little bit too high. So let me show you what you do if you make a mistake. I want to move this line down a bit, so I'm going to take my brush and clean it out. Since I'm working just with wet paint, I can kind of erase it. So that works only if you're using watered down paint and it's pretty fresh. Okay, so since I cleaned off my brush, I'm going to pick up a little bit more paint and I'm going to draw that angle in, but just a little bit lower. Yeah, that should work out. All right. Okay, so this is about all we need to accomplish today, is to get that tinted ground going and lightly sketch in just the basic shapes. Something else you can do while you're working at this level is if you have some really important details like a nose or where you want to place the eyes, or maybe a collar or some dark splotches. Not a lot of detail, don't put in too much. You just want to put in a little bit, just enough so you know where you're going to paint.